In 2013, The Conjuring was the first movie in what would become a long-running cinematic universe, and 5 years after the release of The Nun, a sequel has just been released, directed by Michael Chavez, with a script written by Ian Goldberg, Richard Nang, and Akela Cooper. Let's see if it's an improvement. Good evening. My name's Evan, and welcome to Rocklin Graves. It's very rare for me to find a movie that's so bad that I check how much is left of it every few minutes, but The Nun is one of the very few movies that I would genuinely call unwatchably bad. I love The Conjuring. It's a movie that I cherish because my family would watch it all the time back in the day, and my first time seeing it is one of the most memorable first watches I have for any movie. I'll have to tell that story someday. I really like The Conjuring 2 as well, and there was one Annabelle movie that I thought was pretty good. The one where Annabelle becomes a horse rancher or something like that. I like that one. But I haven't really gotten into the cinematic universe that was spawned by The Conjuring. The third movie was a huge disappointment for me, and after seeing Annabelle Comes Home, I just completely tapped out. Most of these movies are uninspired, schlocky cash grabs trying to use the Conjuring name to get more ticket sales, and The Nun was one of the worst examples of that mentality that I've seen. God forbid I ever make a series reviewing all of these movies, because I really don't want to ever sit through that again, but I was willing to give The Nun a second shot with its sequel because I have always thought that there was potential with the character of Valak that just wasn't utilized very well. Obviously, because of the way I feel about the first movie, I went into the sequel with pretty low expectations. Now, keep in mind that I called the first one unwatchable, which I do find it to be. It's an unbelievably shallow script that was shot poorly and had no idea how to execute scares effectively. So when I say that The Nun II is a notably better movie than the first, that still doesn't mean I'm saying it's very good. Just like the first go around, it's stuffed full of over-the-top, predictable CGI-filled scares with no build-up and often very little recovery period between these points to give them more impact. It's just a bunch of ooga-booga scenes stitched together with something resembling a plot, but thankfully, the stitching here is not as painful as the first movie. The biggest improvements are in the story and the characters, because the movie thankfully spends more time giving some backstory and fleshing out their personalities. A lot of it is still half-baked, but it's better than the moldy ingredients that got left in the back of a Volkswagen on a hot summer day that we had last time. Irene still has her super nun powers, but once again, they're just a plot contrivance to get around storytelling that takes effort. There is a little more history given to her this time around that tries to explain why she's able to do the things she does, and it seems like they thought it was like this big, grand reveal, but as soon as I had some idea of what the story was, I knew exactly what was going on, so the big reveal moment fell totally flat. That being said, Tessa Farmiga is still pretty good. She wasn't bad in the last movie, but the script was so atrocious that I couldn't tell whether or not she was a good actor. The character who's the most improved is Maurice, but that's not hard to do because he was so annoying and bland in the first one. His most developed character trait was having a nickname. Jonas Bloquet gives a solid performance, and he's given some much better material to work with. He has some really sweet scenes that gave the movie a heart that it desperately needed, but I still hate the tie-in they did with The Conjuring at the end of the last movie. It's so forced. The story is still not great, and in a lot of ways it's a complete retread of the first one, which really shows how hard they're trying to squeeze this franchise for everything it's worth. There's a bit more intrigue and progression that made it feel less like a slog to get through, but as with the first movie, I feel like it's not utilizing the setting well. Religious horror is a setting that enables some really interesting exploration of themes like faith, death, repression, purpose, and a whole whack of other things. And I think that's one of the reasons that the direction of this franchise annoys me so much. There is a lot of potential for really deep thematic work, but instead they're using the setting as nothing more than a paint job for shitty scare sequences. I'm not saying that a movie like this has to be some deeply introspective art piece, but it feels like there's so much more that they could be doing here. I'd like if they leaned heavier into the time period and got more into the historical aspects of the story, but it just doesn't seem like they're very interested in really diving into this world and developing it more. While the story and characters are improved, the scare sequences are where both of these movies drive me absolutely crazy. If the narrative elements of a story are mediocre, but there are some creative and well-executed scares, then I can at least latch on to those as a point of entertainment. Look at something like The Boogeyman that came out earlier this year, which had a very basic story, but I still had a good time with it because of the style and the way the scares were handled. Here, the story is also very basic, but the scares are so lazy and uninspired. I do think they were handled better this time around than they were in the first one, and there are one or two cool visuals or intense-ish moments, but overall, this is just bottom of the barrel generic horror movie scares that rely way too much on CGI and have absolutely no impact. It seems like they think just showing Valak all over the place is somehow scary, but they've oversaturated these movies with the demon's face so much that it just doesn't do anything anymore. There are so many moments where it feels like they were going, "Ooh, look at that. That's spooky, huh?" No, it's not. And it wasn't the last 5 times either. Especially when you contrast these sequences with how good James Wan is at building up to an effective scare. The ones here are so insanely bland. There's no understanding of subtlety either. Not everything has to be this big, loud moment filled with fire and blood and screaming. You can have quiet moments that don't explode, and that's often more effective. And you know, sure, there are a few shots where Valak is hidden in the dark and you can only see a vague outline of the features, and that would be creepy if it didn't happen so often. All these subtle moments are ruined because they rely on Valak creeping you out, but we're so used to seeing it at this point, and they've done nothing to make the character scary, so those moments just feel flat. What it boils down to is that this franchise just does not have a grasp on how to craft an effective scare or build up a strong atmosphere. It's usually over-the-top, loud jump scares or predictable and unimpactful moments of Valak just standing there. Both movies had moments where when they started, I thought they'd be really cool, but the way they play out ruined them. One moment in particular I thought was really interesting, but as soon as I realized what would happen, I got annoyed because it was just the same thing again. There's more violence in this one, and it sometimes felt more like a supernatural slasher than a demon movie, but it felt odd in this story. There weren't any particularly creative kills, so I don't think that'll be something to latch onto, but it's definitely ramped up, probably in some sort of desperate attempt to have something scary in this movie. There was one solitary moment where I could feel a little bit of that fear come up towards the end, but it went absolutely nowhere, and then they did the exact same thing 10 minutes later, so that got ruined too. I just don't think this is a very good movie. I wouldn't call it unwatchable, so it's a step up from the first attempt at telling a story dedicated to Valak, but improving on dog shit doesn't make it a diamond. I still found the third act to be extremely stupid, the story isn't engaging enough to justify the longer runtime, there's not a single effective scare, and it once again feels completely unnecessary. I wouldn't recommend it, but there's more of value here than the first movie. It's shot better with a more interesting visual style, the characters are more interesting and feel less like throwaways, and certain moments of the plot grab my attention. I will say that I went Friday night on opening weekend, and there was barely anyone there, so I'm not sure exactly how well this thing's gonna do. I don't see anywhere else for this series to go after this, but I'm sure that if it does make money, they'll try and squeeze a trilogy out of it, and hopefully we can stay on this trajectory and have a movie that does this premise and the character of Valak justice. Maybe at some point I'll actually sit down and watch through all of the movies in the Conjuring universe to make some videos about, but until then, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.